Okay, welcome to our lecture on modern industrial development and production. Really, it's just going to be a brief introduction. The slides are designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. And this is a vocabulary-heavy lecture, so you'll want to make sure you're kind of keeping track of the different vocab words, and if there's things that you're not clear about, make sure that you either do some additional research yourself or ask me to get some clarification. I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture today. So when we start talking about modern industrial production, one of the first things we need to talk about is what's called Fordist production. And Fordist production is named after the American automaker Henry Ford. Okay, and it's the dominant role of mass production that is really dominant from 1945 to about 1970 in the U.S. and Western Europe. But it's that assembly line method of production. Okay, an assembly line, if you're not familiar with the term, just means person A is responsible for taking the widget and putting it on the car. Person B is responsible for tightening the widget. Person C checks the widget to make sure it's tight. Right? Person D checks to make sure that everything got done correctly. Okay, so it's that each person has a very small piece of the process. They have X number of minutes to get, or X number of seconds to get it done in, and that's what they do all day. Okay, and this Fordist period is really marked by a surge not just in mass production, although definitely it's marked by that, but also a surge in mass consumption, the end result of which means that standards of living increased dramatically in that period from 1945 to 1970, and indeed most of the labor-saving devices that you and I know and love really come into popular consumption during that period. Okay, and with that idea of Fordist production, that idea of mass production, is that you want to try and control every stage of the production process, and we call that vertical integration. Okay, and vertical integration in a perfect world literally means you control everything from the resources and the manufacturing those resources, right, down to, in the case of Ford, the sale of the cars, the dealerships that are selling the cars, right? So you own the modes of transportation, you own the factory that's putting together the cars, you own the factory that's making the steel, that's making the screws, that's making the steering systems, the mine for the iron, and the steel manufacturer, and the coal mine, and things like that. Okay, and a big piece of why you want that vertical integration to occur is that it helps you decrease what's called friction of distance. Okay, and friction of distance is really just the increase in time and cost that typically comes with increased distance over which commodities must travel. Right, so a great example of how friction of distance can be a limiting factor are things like furniture manufacturing. And the trick with furniture manufacturing is that it creates products that are both heavy and bulky. Okay, so, and awkward to ship. And this is why, especially historically, less so today, but much more so historically, furniture manufacturers tended to locate close to their markets, and people didn't travel very far to buy furniture because, again, it was expensive to ship. It had a high friction of distance. Okay, increasingly, friction of distance is less and less of an issue, especially in the modern internet age. But for most of the 20th century, and indeed all the time before it, friction of distance was hugely, hugely important in terms of figuring out where different places, where different types of industries located, okay, and also cost of goods. With these ideas, right, we can get into, now we start to talk about where are different factories, different industries located, and part of what we should talk about is localization, which is an idea put forth by British economist Alfred Marshall. You don't really need to know his name. The idea of localization, though, is that local areas develop their local economies based on kind of what goods and services are available. They specialize. Okay. But a name that you do need to know, and a theory you need to make sure that you are familiar with, is Alfred Weber and what's called least cost theory. Okay, and least cost theory, and we'll do a whole different activity on this in class to talk about how these different things impact where factories are placed, but it really looks at the factory owner's desire to minimize three categories of costs. Okay, the first is transportation, which is increasingly less and less of an issue, and we'll talk about that. in a little bit. We'll talk about labor costs, which is the largest cost of any item, okay, that you buy. It's always labor is going to be the most important influence on the ultimate cost of that item. And then also agglomeration costs. And agglomeration is just a fancy way of saying that companies of similar industries, of similar jobs tend to group together. Sorry about that. My son was coming in to ask me a question. So agglomeration, at any rate, is that shared infrastructure that companies in a common industry can share. So let me give you an example. We live in Western Washington, okay, and a great example of agglomeration would be the computer industry in really east of Seattle, right, in the Bellevue area. And so some things that they share, for instance, are a need for extremely high-speed internet that's very reliable. Bellevue has some of the most reliable, most high-speed internet in the state, and arguably in the country or in the world, because of the need to support those industries, right? They're willing to pay extra for it. They provide a lot of jobs in the local economy, and so they can share those costs across the companies in terms of their taxes and things like that. But also, the computer industry needs lots of highly trained and highly skilled individuals in terms of things like programming, right? And that's Bellevue's very well known for computer programming. So they can share the cost of educating those programmers across all of the companies, right? And it's why we have some of the best computer science programs in the world here in Washington State, right? Every time Google donates money to the University of Washington in Seattle to their computer science program, that's money Microsoft doesn't have to spend to help educate computer programs. Okay, so they're able to share those costs. And every time Microsoft sends somebody to work in a local high school to help teach kids computer programming, get them interested in programming, those are costs those are monies Google doesn't have to spend. So it's agglomeration of those shared costs, and it really can add up across time and make a big difference. Along with these ideas is what we call a flexible production system. Okay? And flexible production systems just means that firms can pick and choose their suppliers and also their production strategies. Typically these occur in distant places, and then they can change their choices on a dime to respond to consumer demand or adjustments in production costs, right? And this is great for companies like, say, Boeing, and not so great necessarily for those producers that are producing the different parts in those countries that have those producers. That's a whole different lecture for a whole separate day, right? But in essence, what it means is that, pardon me, if you've got a company like, say, Target or Walmart who wants to sell screen-printed t-shirts, they might buy the t-shirts themselves in, say, Vietnam, all right, and they might pay to get them screen printed in China and then sell them at their stores all around the world, right? Well, if labor costs in China suddenly go up dramatically, maybe now they're paying to screen print in Myanmar, right, where production costs would be significantly lower. And so it's that kind of quick shift. Or they can call their screen printer and say, okay, we're done printing Minions, it's time to do Batman, right? And make that adjustment very, very quickly, and within a week, Batman t-shirts are flooding the market. Okay. With that idea of flexible production are also what's called a product life cycle. And the product life cycle are just those changes that take place in the production of a good across time. Okay, so it's things like the different iterations of the iPod, right, are they part of the iPod's product life cycle. Okay. Increasingly, what we've seen with these flexible production systems, with changes in the product life cycle, with more and more development, come what's called commodification. And this is the idea that goods that were not previously bought, sold, or traded gain a monetary value, and now they are bought, sold, and traded, right? And a great example of this is music, and music's a really great example, because if we go back to late 1800s, early 1900s, right, music itself wasn't bought, sold, or traded. Certainly people were paid for their performances, right, but music wasn't something that you could own outright. These days, right? I want, I hear a song on the radio that I really like. I go to iTunes, I type in the title of the song or maybe the artist's name, find what I need, click, and now I own a copy of that song. Okay, and I paid, 99 cents or $2 or something like that for it. It's that idea that things that weren't bought, sold, traded before now have value and now are being bought, sold, and traded. And what we've seen happening in the modern era is the growth of new centers of industrial activity, and I did a whole other lecture on this. And what we've seen is deindustrialization, right? So that's the process by which companies move industrial jobs to other regions. And the U.S. is at a huge problem, for lack of a better term, with this, right? Certainly Western Europe as well, especially with heavy industry. So what we're seeing is that new industrial regions emerge as shifts in politics, laws, capital flow, and labor availability occur. Right? So if all of a sudden, and I'm just going to pretend here, right, Guam got rid of all of their environmental regulations, a lot of industry would suddenly flock to Guam because environmental regulations can be very expensive to keep up with, right? Again, that's an example. I made it up. Please don't think that Guam actually got rid of all their environmental regulations. But where we have seen a lot of industrialization occur recently is in East Asia, right? Especially in China, but also India slowly but surely becoming more industrialized. And a lot of those countries around China and India have become very important when we start talking about industrialization in the modern world. So this has been our lecture to talk a little bit about modern industrial concepts. We touched on Alfred Weber's least cost theory. We talked about life cycles and product life cycles and flexible production. We talked about where we're starting to see new industries emerge in deindustrialization. And then we started off and we talked about Fordist production and some of those sorts of ideas. So if you have questions, please feel free to come see me during class, and I'd be delighted to answer any of your questions. Until then, adieu.